Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to tonight's study on the book of Acts. I'm your host, John Korkodakis, and glad to have you here. This is week 10 of our 11-week study, and tonight we're diving into chapters 25 to 28. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for those of you that have, gone the whole duration of this study. I hope it's been of value. Hope the notes have been, thanks for the number of you that have talked about the notes and, everything that you can glean from those notes. So I'm just really happy to be able to provide, good teaching material for you to have. I want to remind you too, if you haven't liked, the study, make sure you take a moment to do that. If you want to share it, if you haven't, subscribed, please subscribe. It just helps in so many different ways, and it encourages people to be part of this. This has been just an exciting time, and as we dive into chapters 25 to 28, I just want to make a few comments. I want to once again remind you not to miss the final, closing session of this particular study. When we, tonight we're going to finish off the book, the chapter by chapter component of the book. But next week we're going to, say what are all the things that we've learned in the book of Acts that are important for us to take away today. What are the overarching themes, theology, lessons, applications that are so vitally important for us to, to see in our modern context why the book of Acts is so important for us to get a good handle on everything that it teaches us. So make sure you're here next week as we do that. And tonight, and again, most of us, just a quick note on these last number of chapters. Most of us, when we talk about the book of Acts, we're often stuck in the first section of the book of Acts. And that's not necessarily, our fault or a lack of, being brought into, an understanding of the latter chapters, because the latter chapters of Acts are really quite different than the opening chapters. And the opening chapters are really exciting. We have, Jesus being taken up to heaven, Pentecost, the early persecution, the early explosion of the church. So those are all exciting things, and signs and wonders and miracles and many of those things that makes the early church so exciting. But as we get into the latter chapters, we're getting into, Paul's defense of the message of the gospel, and just the persecution that he personally experiences, and how that is used by God to continue growing the church as it starts to become this worldwide phenomena at the time. So these closing chapters are really, really very important, because you could read them, and if you have read them, and hopefully you've been reading along as we've gone. If you've had read them, it's a lot of trials and persecutions and standing before governors and procurators and people of political importance and having to defend. But there are some vital lessons that come out of all of this as well, especially as we experience how the Apostle Paul manages all of this. So last week when we were studying, we saw that Paul was before Felix, and Felix left Paul in prison for 2 years and didn't deal with the situation at all. And now as we start into chapter 25, a new person has showed up by the name of Festus, and he's now the one that is dealing with the Apostle Paul. So as chapter 25 opens up, I've got a little chart in your notes where it shows all the times that Paul has had to defend himself. and those are in the chart in your notes. And it's 5 times that the book of Acts records the Apostle Paul having to defend himself. So, that chart is just a really cool reference for the future, or any time that those issues come up for you having to deal with. But Festus actually was considered a wise and moderate governor compared to Felix. Felix was so horrible that the next person had to look good compared to how horrible Felix was. So, the people were kind of relieved historically with this Festus, and but he was still unable to quell the Jewish unrest. And this is a mere 10 years before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Now, 70 AD, if you don't know the historical timeline of the Jewish people, 70 AD is the diaspora, when the temple is destroyed, the city itself is destroyed, the people are dispersed, and it's absolutely a brutal experience. So this is a mere 10 years before this happens. And the Jewish uprising is continuing to just, fester and fester. And it really comes to a head that the Romans have to deal with it. So this new governor in place, the cycle with Paul starts all over again. This time, as Festus visits Jerusalem, the Jewish leaders appeal to have Paul return there. We want Paul. They haven't forgotten that Paul is on their hit list, and they want him. So, they're asking Festus, this new governor, to hand him over to go there. This is likely due to the realization that they had little grounds in a Roman court to try Paul. And they're hoping this new governor is just going to, just kind of wash his hands of the situation and give Paul over. But the problem is, Paul is a Roman citizen. That is not something that a governor wants to get caught doing. Josephus himself records that Ishmael had succeeded Ananias as high priest in the final days of Felix. This man by the name of Ishmael. Therefore, whatever spirit of antagonism and corruption that existed in the high priesthood, continues. They want Paul. None of the targeting of Paul has changed at all, and it seems that none of the corruption that existed in the high priesthood at the time has been, alleviated at all. So. Festus wanted to gain favor. Obviously, every governor that's been enlisted by Rome to govern this area has tried to appease the Jews or gain favor in one way or another with the Jews. So Festus is no different in this particular manner. So he actually asks Paul, as you read the text, whether you would be willing to stand trial in Jerusalem. He says, would you be willing to do that? Which is fascinating for a governor to even do. Paul, in turn, again, appeals for a trial in Rome. This is a right that a Roman citizen has. And Paul's utilizing this to full effect. Anytime that a Roman citizen thought that his life was endangered in a lower court, he could appeal to Rome. He could appeal to the higher court. And citizens who were murderers, pirates, or thieves could not make this appeal. Now, Julius Caesar actually was captured by pirates, and he swore to go back and kill every last one of them, if you know the history of Caesar. And he actually did that. He hunted every last one down and killed them. So these kinds of people don't have the same rights type of thing. They're not afforded the same courtesies in the court of law. So Nero happens to be the emperor at this particular time. He was emperor from 54 to 68 AD, and we all know that, about the end years of Nero. History records that his early years were actually admirable. But beginning in about 62 AD, his behavior turns erratic. and especially against Christians. Christians become the target of his antagonism and the target of just blaming them for anything that was convenient for Nero. And that just became a problem. Now here in this section too, we have Agrippa, King Agrippa, arrives in verses, and we have this conversation between Festus and Agrippa, King Agrippa, in verses 17 to 21, in chapter 25. And it's a beautiful, because it tells intimate details of the political motivations between the two. Festus is saying, there's some Jewish, theology thing going on, and they're really after this guy. He's appealing to Caesar. So I'm just going to send him on. And interestingly enough, the Festus is kind of dealing with this relatively quickly in his governorship. And Agrippa says, well, I want to talk to him. I want to hear what this guy's all about, because obviously the other thing about this is Paul's got a reputation. He is someone that people know about, that he is, gained some, or I would say a lot of notoriety. And Agrippa wants to hear him out like anybody else of interest would want to. Now, Agrippa, just as a background, if you've got your notes, Agrippa is next in the long line of officials who bear witness to Paul's faith. He happens to be the grandson of Herod the Great. He was in control of the temple treasury, and he was the one that actually could appoint the high priest. So, there's political, machinations going on between the high priesthood and King Agrippa. His relationship with Bernice, who was his sister, has historically been suspicious for a long, long time. In fact, there are many historians that claim that it was incestuous. There's no, smoking gun per se, but many people of that time period claim that it had to be an incestuous relationship. And Agrippa ends up being, Robert said, Julius Caesar said the pirates should ask twice as much as they were initially asking for ransom for his release. Yeah, thanks, Robert. I forgot about that part of it. Julius Caesar said, yeah, you should be asking double for me. That's right. Thanks for that. That's a great historical point. Caesar was really something else. But Agrippa was the last of the Herodian dynasty. He lived in Caesarea Philippi. Remember Caesarea Philippi? If you remember in the book of Matthew, that's where Jesus was with his disciples. And that's where he said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He renamed it Neronius in honor of Nero. He himself attempted to subdue the Jewish revolt between 66 and 70. Those 4 years were absolutely turmoil, but it failed. And Agrippa then became a staunch ally of the Romans, and he was likely present with Titus, who was the Roman general and Emperor Vespasian's son, at the celebration of the fall of the Jews in their temple in 70 AD. It is very, very, very likely that Agrippa was there and witnessed the entire massacre and destruction and just the brutality of General Titus and the Emperor Vespasian. That they just had enough of the Jewish revolt, and they just wanted to put an end to it. He actually wrote to the historian Josephus, praising him for his book called The Jewish War, and even bought a copy. So, we're seeing all these historical linkages and items of interest that are part of the story in Acts. And so it's grounded in reality. It's grounded in history. It's grounded in political and religious figures who are interacting with each other, and really, really important. Jason Snellgrove said, oh yeah, inbreeding was likely responsible for many of the erratic behaviors especially with Nero. Yes, his entire love of his mother and stuff like that was really something else. Yeah, thanks for that, Jason. Nero was really something else. Interesting that the matter of the resurrection appears to be the main topic, while the other charges have faded, from view. So remember we said earlier on in the book, as we got into the book of Acts, of the whole message and theology of the resurrection is the primary message in the book of Acts. And here we're seeing it, that even as Paul is being put on trial, Jewish people are making accusations, and the political figures are trying to mediate that. They recognize that this whole matter of the resurrection is what all of this is being weighed on. Predominantly what all of this is being weighed upon. Now Paul appears before Agrippa. Agrippa says, I want to meet this guy. I want to talk to him and hear him out. And this, in the book of Acts, is the longest defense that we have of the Apostle Paul. It centers on the gospel more than the charges against Paul. The setting is one that's accorded with a visit from royalty. Paul is center stage, and he's center stage with a host of military, political, public dignitaries. They've all gathered to hear this particular person, this Paul, this one that used to be a Pharisee zealot against the people of the way, who is now their predominant voice, and is started churches all over the Mediterranean known world of that time. So they want to hear him out. Festus reviews the reasons for the hearing, and he notes there is nothing worthy of death in the charges. He states that. His preamble highlights the following: the degree of injustice Paul has been subjected to. He acknowledges that. And Paul and Christianity is not a threat to Rome. Pilate made similar statements concerning the innocence of Jesus. Made similar statements. But Paul's next trial is in Rome. This was simply a hearing to acquaint Agrippa with the case and kind of help Festus in giving the emperor a reason for why we're sending him. We're sending Paul, but we just can't do that in an arbitrary way. We have to have good reason as to why we are sending this man to Nero. So the speech is likely, let me get the next slide up here. The speech is the kind of opportunity Paul longs for. As we've seen throughout the entire book of Acts, there's riots, there's people that want to, kill him, and, there's crowds that are gathered. Paul sees it as an opportunity to preach, an opportunity to talk about Jesus. And especially after 2 years in prison. Now, he's probably done a lot of writing. Again, many scholars have estimated that Paul did a lot of writing during this time, these 2 years that he was, held up by Felix. But Paul's got this opportunity to speak to these people, and he stresses that it is because of his Jewish heritage that he believes and proclaims his message. The Jewish hope finds fulfillment in the gospel of Christ. Now, as Christians, if you're a believer here tonight, that we see definitively the Old Testament being the precursor to the gospel of Jesus Christ and the coming of the Messiah, etc., etc. All those links and continuities and messianic expectations that are all through the Old Testament. And here's Paul saying, this is the logical endpoint of what the Old Testament has been pointing to for a long, long time. And verse 8 stands as the central apologetic for the church in its entire history. Paul says, why is it so unbelievable that you think God can't raise the dead. Like, why is that so hard? If God is God, why do you find it so hard to believe that he can raise the dead? And that's what that verse essentially says. And again, Paul recounts his own conversion. That is an important part of all of this. And I think we've stated that at least 3 times in the book of Acts, we have a recounting of Paul's conversion experience. And Paul, Paul demonstrates his ability to contextualize his message. We've said this ad nauseum, and if you haven't learned anything about Paul, one thing I hope you've learned is that he's a master of knowing his audience and contextualizing the message. He's a master at that. And he's using common expressions for opposing the inevitable by fighting against God's will. If you look at 26:14, he's using idioms. Saul, Saul, why do you? Well, we all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic. And the other idiom is in verse 26. Where it says, the king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. That's a common Jewish idiom for that time. And Paul is contextualizing all of this stuff in modern lingo and idioms for them to understand and see the relevance of his message right then and there. Verse 23 encapsulates the heart of Paul's gospel proclamation, as well as much of the theological rendering that he does. Verse 23 says that the Christ would suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead, would proclaim light to his own people and to the Gentiles. Now, that's a good summation and encapsulation of the entire message that Paul does in all of his writings. That's kind of like the heart of his proclamation message. Now Festus responds. His particular response has been echoed throughout the centuries. The gospel sounds mad whenever people are strapped to a natural world. Okay, if you're all about the natural world, it's what Paul is proclaiming is going to sound like madness, and that's what the way that Agrippa responds. This is madness, and takes that upon himself. So as we move along, Paul asserts that what he says is true and reasonable. Okay, he has built his case in a way that that is directed right at Agrippa, and places Agrippa in a dilemma. In fact, he's presented it in such a way that he's put Agrippa on the hot seat. You wanted to hear me out. This is what I'm all about. You have a choice in front of you. Now, are you going to believe this or are you not, King Agrippa? And if Agrippa agrees with Paul, he loses face before Festus and the other Roman dignitaries and all the people that are there experience this. What? Agrippa, you now a Christian? Okay? But if Agrippa agrees to belief in the prophets, because this is the way that Paul is, his influence over his Jewish audience has become damaged. Okay? Therefore, his response is non-committal. Okay? Here we have an example in these verses of the politics taking over a person's need for what he really has to have in his life. Okay, he doesn't want to damage his political life, so he's being non-committal in this particular situation. And as Paul's speech began as a defense, it ends in a direct missionary appeal to Agrippa and everyone that's within earshot. You either believe this is the heart of what I'm about. Jesus came, died, the prophets predicted this. You need now that you've heard this, you need to respond in one way or another. Agrippa confirms once again that, as a defense, Agrippa confirms once again that Paul's innocence. There's nothing so far about what Paul is about that the Romans, need to, do anything about. This is a theological thing. Even though he confirms Paul's innocence, it's interesting that Luke places a great amount of stress on this final observation at the end of chapter 26, that Paul would have been free had he not appealed to Caesar. That Paul would have been free. But Paul is convinced that the Spirit of God is moving him towards Rome. And from here, we start in chapter 27, the passage to Rome. Okay, that's where we are. The journey begins to Rome. And, the story of Paul's journey to Rome is done absolutely with a wealth of detail, which is really striking. It's like the details, were they really necessary? Because wasn't getting to Rome and what's going to happen in Rome going to be of primary importance? But there's a lot of detail and a lot of good reason for that detail. Luke is presenting Paul as God's man. This is God's man. Very important, and this is who God is using to do incredible things. And now he's on his way to Rome to meet with the emperor, Nero. Even though Paul is a prisoner at this time and he's been put on this boat, he actually becomes a leader. Like, people are looking to him. He's a natural, and people are looking to him, and a witness to all that travel with him. And that's the way that Luke is presenting this. Paul's arrest in Caesarea was from 57 to 59 AD. The trip to Rome lasted 59 to 60 AD. So this is a long, arduous, time that Paul's been waiting to get to Rome. Paul likely wrote Romans during his 3-month stay in Corinth at the end of his third missionary journey around 57 AD in preparation for his eventual trip to Rome. So, it's absolutely reasonable that when Paul arrives in Rome, they have the book of Romans. There are churches there that have that book, and I think that's really cool. Luke has been with Paul since chapter 20, verse 5 in Troas. And beginning here, we have the longest of the 4 we sections in Acts 27, 1 to 28, 16. And you see all the other sections, because there are times where Luke is personally involved in the experience with Paul. He's not just writing, from a standpoint of, Spirit of God, giving the revelation to Luke and him hearing all the details of Paul's journeys and everything that's happened. Luke is absolutely an eyewitness to everything that is happening in this section. Now, below is a chart that details the storm that you read about in chapter 27, where the shipwreck and this difficulty that they experience on the way to Rome. Now, what's interesting is that what I was in a class a number of years ago, and I remember there was a professor who had a degree in psychology and was dealing with stress, and he walked us through this particular passage of the shipwreck and demonstrated how everyone was responding like the way people normally respond to very, very high levels of stress, and the things that they were doing and what was happening. And yet, the person who is sort of keeping it all together in the midst where everyone else is falling apart is the Apostle Paul. Now, the Apostle Paul did, receive an angelic vision that said that the ship will sink. Now think about this. You just got a revelation from God, or you've just heard from God, and God says, guess what? The boat you're on is going to sink. And you're going, God, like what? Like, I thought you were, protecting me, but the vision also stated that everyone was going to survive. Everyone was going to be okay. And they were going to come out the other side. Paul becomes their leader, so that even when they abandon their own decisions on how to survive, they're looking to Paul about how to survive. It's not the captain that they're going to. It's Paul that they're going to. And Paul even, there's an allusion in verses 33 to 37 that Paul kind of has a little bit of the Lord's Supper as he's having this meal. And scholars have been arguing about this. Is this a formal Lord's Supper or communion time? But, almost everybody agrees it has the spirit and essence of the Lord's Supper behind it. Okay, and this might not be contextually the best place for Lord's Supper theology or anything like that, but it shows you the mindset of the Apostle Paul, even in the most dire of circumstances, with this shipwreck going on. So anyway, I haven't put the chart up on the notes or anything like that, but if you have your notes in front of you, the chart is really, shows a great lesson in stress and what happens. Here, day one, they attempt to resist the storm, and they can't resist it, and then they try to adjust to the storm, and then they just kind of give up, and they say, okay, we're going to have to endure this storm. And then in day two, they're violently tossed by the wind, and they begin to lighten the ship. So a little bit of panic starts heading in. Okay, this is too much for us to handle. We're going to need to, jettison things off and get them off the boat, because if we're going to survive this, or even attempt to survive this, we got to lighten the load. And when so as the notes say, they tried to fix it. Okay, they they have this actions and reactions the first day, but the second day they're trying to fix it. Okay, and it's not working. And then day three comes when we face severe storms. It says we plan for survival, and non-essential aspects of life are abandoned. Okay, day three, they start throwing the tackle overboard with their bare hands. That's what they do. So the level of stress, understandably, is now escalating tremendously. And this storm goes on for a long time. As the storm continues, plans and actions now become irrational, and survival attempts are often really self-destructive. Day 13 in verses 20 to 21, they've given up hope. It's a hopeless situation, and they're experiencing loss of appetite, which is what happens. It's just, we can't bear it any longer. We've been under duress for so long. There's just no turning back. This thing is not abating. This thing is not, letting up. And all of this is unbearable. Now, what was interesting about all this is that if you look at the positive side of this, because we don't often in the storms want to see the positive side, but when you stand back in the book of Acts and you look at the overall picture, what happens is that it ends up providing a shortcut to Rome. Now, without getting into a whole bunch of explanation, it actually curtails one of the ways that they were going to go, and kind of gives it a bit of a shortcut. Paul's credibility rises exponentially in this particular thing. He's the one that demonstrates leadership skills. He's the one that keeps calm. He's the one that keeps assuring people all of that kind of stuff. It allowed for the conversion and the healing of those on Malta. Now, they're going to end up on Malta, and it ends up being a little diversion that ended up, bringing great praise and wonders to that particular island. It provided rebuke to those who rejected the counsel of God through Paul. Paul had said, we're going to be okay. It could have crashed. We're going to be okay. And it was instrumental in providing Paul's position of ministry in Rome, because there's a lot that goes ahead of him because of this whole situation. Now, you take this pandemic, by the way, there's a number of people that are wringing their hands over this pandemic. But I'll tell you right now, the tragedy of this particular pandemic is if we don't, as churches, really learn a lesson to what is happening. There's no way no one can convince me that the church is being persecuted right now. That is just, as far as I'm concerned, that is just nonsense. But what is potentially happening is this could be the birth pangs of something happening that exposes people to the kingdom of God. Another thing that could definitely be happening now is pruning. We might be going through a season of pruning as churches. And the pruning is never easy. But to call it persecution, I just, really have trouble with that personally. It's just not in the equation. And, Liz, hi Liz, nice to have you. Your country of birth, that's amazing. That's a wonderful part of the world, by the way. Wonderful part of the world. So Paul has become so invaluable in this whole thing that when the ship goes down, you realize, by the way, because there's prisoners on this ship, the captain would have been commanded to kill all the prisoners if there was a shipwreck, or if pirates had tried to get on board, anything like that. That would have been the responsibility of the captain, and that would have been the orders: kill all the prisoners. Okay? No one gets away alive. But Paul, Paul says, don't do it. Don't do it. And the commander doesn't allow it and listens to the Apostle Paul. That's how invaluable he's become. Okay. All right. Let's get on to the next slide and see. So, from Malta, they're now on the island of Malta. And while there, Paul is bitten by a snake. And the people see it as a test of guilt. Okay, a little bit of superstition happening here. Every culture's got it, and because Paul's been bitten by the snake, everybody, sees that wow, this means something. And when Paul survives, they reach for the other extreme and consider him a god. Hey, you must be a god to survive this snake bite. You must be. And what it did prove is that nothing was going to thwart the plan of God in getting Paul to Rome. That's one of the key things that you need to take. Paul's going to Rome, God ordained it. Nothing's going to stop it. And Paul ends up healing Publius, his father. And it begins an island-wide healing ministry, resulting in resulting in the people responding in ways of practical gratitude for what is done. It is difficult. I've written here that it's difficult to imagine how strange the scene when you consider that Paul is still a prisoner, and this whole entire healing ministry is going. And if somebody said, "Hey, that Paul guy's really amazing," and somebody said, "Yeah, you know what, but he's actually one of the prisoners. We're taking him, to Rome." And everybody went, "What?" This guy's healing people, and the miracle and the signs and the wonders is happening right here. And God used that time for Paul to touch other people, that if they had have just gone, if the boat never sunk, they never would have had this experience, right? None of those people would have been touched. And again, do we understand the ways of God fully? The plan of God, the purposes of God? We have inklings, we have, some pretty scriptural directions about God's desire for people to be saved, to send his son, all of those beautiful things that we celebrate as Christians. But here's a wonderful story of an island that got touched because of the shipwreck. That otherwise we don't know, what. But God ordained it that, shipwreck or not, it was still used positively by God. And I think that's a really powerful lesson. I really do. That in the midst of the worst of times, we can experience the best of God's resources in the midst of those times. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about this particular section, that maybe, if you read it with just, wanting to get through the book and not really delving into some of the details of this, it just might be an interesting story that they got shipwrecked and this other stuff happened. But I think it says a lot about God's desire to see others, many others, and plant seeds of the gospel of Jesus Christ into the lives of so many people. And here's an opportunity where this key man that God has been using to touch many, many people is absolutely, demonstrated in this particular, story as we get to it. All right. So now we're at this last kind of season here. Paul ends up in Rome. So he's arrived in Rome. And what's interesting about the book of Acts is that you would have expected a lot more section about what's happening in Rome. But it seems to have, satisfied the intent of the book. We've gotten Paul to Rome. That's what, from chapter 20 onward was the kind of important direction of the book. So the first thing that Paul, one of the early things that Paul does is he meets with the local Jewish leaders. He again, very intentional as to why he does what he does. And, first off, he wants to defend all the false charges against him, though none had been received. So he's assumed that all these false charges, or the Jewish people would have sent emissaries or people or letters stating, this Paul guy is coming your way, and, he is dangerous, and he's left behind, this trail of damage and all the accusations that we have against him, but the Romans wouldn't try him, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. But this doesn't seem to be the case for Paul. And due to strong Jewish opposition, he had to appeal to Caesar based on the strong Jewish opposition. And, to be honest, we've said many, many times that Paul could have been freed. But would he have been left alone if the Romans had said, okay, there's nothing that we have against you. There's nothing that we can try you for based on what we're hearing from the Jewish people. Paul was being hunted down everywhere he went, so there would have been no peace for him. This is kind of like the closing chapter of his life that made the entire experience of him as the primary missionary of the early church. This becomes the capstone of his experience, is to go to Rome, there with the emperor, and proclaim at the center of the most powerful nation at the time the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if you've read the book of Romans, by the way, you know it is one of the central treatises of the Christian faith, and it has all the theological nuances of what it means to be a Christian, especially chapter 8. If you want to learn what it means to be a Christian, Romans chapter 8, that entire chapter, is sort of like the best synopsis of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ and to claim yourself as a Christian. And also, Paul sees this as an opportunity to present Israel's Messiah. And imagine sitting with Paul with all these Jewish leaders as he's telling them about, the fulfillment of the Torah and the Old Testament, and how Israel's Messiah has come. And he was crucified, but he was raised from the dead 3 days later. Just really powerful stuff. As with most of Acts, the response to Paul's message is mixed, which again, I'm really encouraged by that. Here's the Apostle Paul, and he's getting mixed responses to his preaching, even though he's a master of adopting to the context of the people that he's speaking to. It's not like 100% slam dunk every time. There are people that resist. There are people that respond. And, I think that's an encouragement for us. What is important to remember is that we do it and let God do the rest. That's what's vitally the key takeaway from that, that particular truth. Romans. Oh, Don, you're at Romans 8 right now. Oh, amen. That's got to be a really cool place to be. Yeah, I'm sure you're going to sit on that for the entire night, because that's a great chapter. Amen to that. Paul leaves them with a scriptural warning, and he quotes Isaiah 6:9-10. Now, 6:9-10. That's if they have ears to hear, they'll be blind and deaf, and that was a part of Isaiah's message when the Lord said to him, "Who is going to go for me?" And Isaiah said, "Send me. I'll go." And basically, oh yeah, but it's going to fall on deaf ears. There's just something about religiosity. There's something about I hate to say it, but something about religion that can actually keep us from God. And that, or keep us, arm's length from God. There's just something about, how we want to minimize or put God in a box, or put our expectations around God in such a way that can actually keep us from experiencing Him, in the fullness of what God intends. And I know that's not an intention by many people, but the reality is that happens. So he quotes that warning out of 6:9-10. For 2 years, Paul was allowed to proclaim his message in Rome. Now think about that. For 2 years. Okay? The final word in Acts is the Greek word akoulotos. And what it means, which is really, staggering when I think about it, it means without hindrance or restrictions, with freedom. So it says, the word is used 25 times in the New Testament and 7 times in the book of Acts, that they were proclaimed without hindrance, without restrictions, without freedom. And by the way, that's a really important note to make for this pandemic. We don't have a hindrance. We're not restricted of proclaiming the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. Okay, that's probably why I'm such a potent advocate for the way our particular church has taken, because of things like this in the book of Acts. That when we get hindered with the gospel, and if you remember earlier, when John and Peter were put in prison, they said, yeah, don't proclaim Jesus any longer. And they went, ha, forget that. And they walked out of prison. They were flogged or whatever. They considered suffering for Jesus a privilege and an honor, but they continued to proclaim Jesus. Okay? All right? So, yeah, so we're suffering and all this kind of stuff to try to put us in prison, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, it's if you start to hinder us in being able to proclaim the message, that you got another thing coming. Another thing coming. And that's my stance too, by the way. If you know, the moment we're hindered, the moment we're told we can no longer preach the gospel, that's right. Robert says so that Paul could proclaim the gospel freely while he was locked down. Yeah, absolutely. While he was locked down, he proclaimed the gospel freely. Now, you know, to close this whole section, I've got a quote there from James Emery White in his Church and Culture blog. Now, I happen to really like James Emery White. He's got some really beautiful things in wow. I just lost what I was trying to show you. Okay. Anyway, just let me get back to this live scene and just do it from that. For some reason, my notes were mixed up, but I have just as a conclusion to the entire thing is a note by James Emery White. That's in your notes. And this is what he wrote in his Church and Culture blog back in 2016. I've kept this since 2016. He said, Acts is a book about Jesus' gospel going through barrier after barrier as it breaks out into the world and into the hearts of men and women. It's about the church overcoming roadblocks and impediments, persecutions and trials, as it grows and boldly proclaims Christ. And it's about individuals who will not allow anything to stop them from being used by God to take Christ to the world. Unhindered is the last word in the book of Acts. And I think that's a beautiful final word in the book of Acts. And, you know, some of you may be reading this saying, okay, we're being hindered, we're being persecuted and all that kind of stuff. And I just say, I don't see it. I don't see the hindrance, the same kind of thing happening in the book of Acts that we are seeing today. You know, we are unhindered like they were in the book of Acts. Even though they were in prison and all, they were unhindered in being able to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's a beautiful way to end the book of Acts, is to see everything that is happening and the barriers that continue to be raised, and the church primarily proclaiming Christ, not our personal rights and freedoms. It was proclaiming Christ. That is a huge difference in what is happening today. We're seeing a lot of people talking about their personal rights and their freedoms and claiming to be Christians, but that's not what we're seeing in the book of Acts. What we're seeing in the book of Acts is the central proclamation of Christ, no matter what. And if there's a barrier that's going to stop me from proclaiming Christ, then that's a barrier that I'm not going to tolerate when it comes to the world around us. So anyway, that's a bit of a rant on my part, and apologize for that. But that's why the book of Acts is so important for us to get a handle on in our current climate, if that means anything to you. Because what motivates the growth of the early church and the breaking of barriers is the message that the church proclaims. Christ above all, the resurrected Lord, that you need to claim faith in and repent of your sin and start becoming a follower of Jesus Christ. And the whole book of Acts, with all the adventures and with all the stories and with all the signs and all the wonders and all the miracles, its central message is about Jesus and Jesus alone. Thanks, everyone. Hey, I'm actually a few minutes early after doing 4 chapters. We're concluding the study and allowing us to sort of pause before the final week next week. And I want to remind you, next week we're going to go through all the things that we've learned about the book of Acts, how it, how the book of Acts, applies to our modern culture and our modern day, and why it's important for all of us. And Donna, agree, the prince of the world, and that's why we need to proclaim Christ and call for the Holy Spirit, because darkness prevails in this world, and in fact the world is getting darker. I'm sorry, I happen to think the world is darker, but the only hope of the world as the church is the central proclamator of that, and that's the gospel of Jesus Christ. Okay, I hope you guys have been blessed. I can't wait for next week to get through all of the big applicational component. See you next week. God bless you, and thanks for being here. And remember, like or share or subscribe. Really love to have you as part of the team. God bless you.